All right, thanks everybody. We're going to get started here while people are still grabbing some food. So a few years ago, we did our first large conference on the 50th anniversary, marking the 50th anniversary of the Animal Welfare Act, and Jim Keane was our keynote speaker for that. And the presentation he gave was super powerful, and really reminded everyone in the room that most of the speakers over the previous 2 days were pretty critical of the Animal Welfare Act, but Jim kind of brought it all back together to show that, you know, it still is a really valuable tool, and here's what happens when you don't have the protections of the Animal Welfare Act. So it's great to have Jim back here. He's an associate professor at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and he's a veterinarian who worked at the Meat Animal Research Center, and based on what he saw, decided to become a whistleblower, which led to a series of articles in the New York Times that were really impactful, both from a public opinion point of view and also the agencies. The USDA actually took some action on that. So I'll let him talk more specifically about that, but please join me in welcoming Jim Keane.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. First off, I want to acknowledge my... Oh, maybe to turn it on.
Yeah, it is. Let's just turn it on. Okay.
How's that? Better? Yeah, okay. Anyway, yeah, thank you, Chris. And I want to acknowledge my colleague, Jacqueline Aaron, over here on the cross. We work together on animal welfare related issues. So let's get started. There's some acronyms. You probably know most of this information. So I'll give, since you don't know, a little overview of how industrial ag industry and industrial research, they're actually very close together. They do the same things. A little bit about some abuse examples at MARC that I observed. My whistleblowing experience as a form of research regulation, as Chris said, things change because of that, so it had a regulatory effect. And then a little bit on a summary. And you probably know those terms: AWA, IACUC, CAFO, which is a factory farm, MARC or MARC is Meat Animal Research Center, and UNL is University of Nebraska. So I was at the Meat Animal Research Center for 26 years, 19 of those years working for USDA, and 7 for University of Nebraska. It's run cooperatively by those two institutions, although USDA rules. So I was a clinical vet there, I was a researcher, I was faculty for UNL. I was in limbo on leave after the whistleblowing for about 18 months, and then I was transferred to the Lincoln campus a few years ago. So one thing about industrial ag research and the livestock industry is most of the practices that they have came out of research at USDA or land-grant universities, which are the public universities, like mostly in the Midwest, probably some out here. They all have a big component of industrial animal developing those methods, which I'll cover briefly here. Anybody know what this picture is of? Do you know what kind of industrial farm that is? This is some... Pardon? It's a feedlot, right. So these are very common throughout the Great Plains because you have the corn there and cattle are there. So each of those represent, this guy, he takes, or she takes satellite, no, it's a he. I think he's Danish, if I remember right. Takes satellite images and makes them into works of art, usually of industrial farms. So each of those pens, these are those little squares as a pen. Those little black dots are cattle. There's about 200 per pen. So if this was a factory farm, typically a factory farm might have 200 animals. So each of those pens represents, each of those pens represents a past normal farm. So it's like a consolidation of many, many real farms. I'll use that term. And of course, all that thing on the upper right, that's pollution. They're run by mostly undocumented immigrants who are abused on the labor side. So the point is there's lots of different, I'll call them pathologies, that occur all together on a industrial farm. Pretty much true for all of them. So here's kind of what they are. Animal welfare is one big issue. I mentioned the environmental impact. There's food safety issues. Those cattle are full of, I did research on this for many years, salmonella and pathogenic E. coli that affect people. You don't know what's going on there. The communities are ruling because, as I said, that feedlot represents, in the past, a couple hundred normal farms that went out of business. and then the worker welfare. So the bad news is those are all interconnected, but the good news is that if you, say, for example, improve the environmental harm, decrease that, you also get improved animal welfare. So you can, that's the, since they're all interconnected, it's a good-bad situation. So I kind of use 1980 as the cutoff when factory farms became dominant. But there's actually a change of terminology. It used to be called animal husbandry, and now it's called animal science and animal production. You had farmers producing food, and now you have producers making a commodity. It used to be called large animal vets. Now we're called food supply vets who do production medicine. And individual animals used to have high value, and now they have very low value, which is one reason the factory farm model is based on the economies of scale, because each individual animal is worth very little. So there was a person named Earl Butz who was the Secretary of Ag under President Nixon and Ford. And he had a huge influence on ag policy. He switched the policy from being sort of supply management. He mostly dealt with crops, but animals rely on the crops for feed, so they're very interrelated, to maximizing output, maximize production. He had this very famous phrase, get big or get out. So he had actually had, if you read a history of what he did, he had a very, very huge impact. One of the critical people in indirect animal welfare, but in promoting U.S. agriculture into the industrial model, both on the crop side and the animal side. If you pick favorites, some crops get subsidies, like corn and soybeans, sugar cane. And so I personally don't blame farmers for becoming producers because it's following the money. There's a lot of subsidies, and it's really hard not to follow that system. Even if you want to escape, you're kind of trapped. I forgot what I was going to say with this slide. It's a great sculpture, and the title is strange too. No one knows what it means. But I guess it kind of represents using animals, I would say. We kind of use them or abuse them. Okay, so how does factory farming work and the research game work? Because they're basically the same thing. They have three goals, basically. One is production efficiency, make as much as you can for the least amount of inputs. Most outputs for the least amount of inputs. Second, make cheap and plentiful commodity, which means you sacrifice quality for quantity. Make as much as you can. And then there's something I call the feed the world myth, which people justify. I won't go into it here, but it's a myth that we feed the world. I can say like 5% of U.S. food exports go to food insecure countries. So we're not feeding, and that means I think it's 2,500 calories per day, less than that defines a food insecure country. So we're not feeding the world. Our food exports go to Japan, South Korea, Western Europe, wealthy countries. So the results of the industrial system, whether it's crop or animals, you do get a huge increase in output, numbers of cows or pounds of meat or whatever you want, outcome metric you want to use. But there's all these consequences. You get biodestruction of the environment. Of course, you have the animal welfare, the public health issues from food safety, which I worked on for a long time. There's huge socioeconomic costs, rural demise. Out in Nebraska, the small towns are dying. It used to be lots of farmers. Now there's a very small number. There's no kids to fill the schools. Has huge impacts in rural areas. Worker well-being. And one issue is what I call, there's lots of huge economic subsidies, economic externalities that the crop and animal side of industrial ag don't pay for. Things like pollution. So they can pollute, but they don't, and so the public pays for that with tax dollars to clean it up, but they're not covering it. So that makes the food artificially cheap. So they get both direct subsidies from the government through the Farm Bill, but also don't pay for damages that they cause. Okay, so these are the basically four elements of production ag, which also what you do in research. So one is this intensive management. Basically, I call it the prison model. Get as many, buildings are expensive, so you get as many as you can in there for the shortest amount of time. I don't know if anybody can tell, but can anybody tell me what the green, the second square is, the green image? It was a screen grab, so I'm not sure you can tell. It's a bullfrog CAFO. In China. They're American bullfrogs that they raise. That's how crowded they are. So you can make any animal species into an industrial ag system. So that's one, and I call them prisons. The second model is feed efficiency. That matters because 3/4 of the cost of raising an animal is the feed. So most research, a lot of research is on finding feeds that you can decrease the cost, since that's the biggest component. The problem is they feed anything. One thing is, you probably remember years ago, they fed dead cows to live cows, and that caused not a good idea. Probably the biggest negative impact ever in industrial ag. And the University of Nebraska invented it, by the way. Third is genetic selection, where basically you pick one body part and you select and select and select. In dairy cow, it's for milk production. So you keep on selecting it more and more. Other animals, it might be muscle mass. Depends on what the product is. But you select for, genetically select for one body system at the expense of everything else, welfare, whatever else it would be. Factory pharmacology, you probably know this. Antibiotics, injectables, antibiotics in the feed. That's been regulated a little bit. Hormones, growth promotants. The one thing they don't use very much is pain management, which is kind of interesting. I mean, they do things like, typical castration, dehorning, those type of things. You rarely use any pain medication, which is strange, but they use so many other medications, but not for pain. And all those are designed to feed into this production efficiency model, which is based on free stuff. About $38 billion per year in livestock subsidies from the federal government, local tax breaks in Nebraska. They have communities where you don't pay taxes for several years, for example, if you put in a feedlot, and the negative economic externalities that I mentioned previously. You've seen these before. Anyone know what these are? Chris does. Anybody else know what those? Okay, the one on your left, those are gestation crates. So each of those sows are pregnant, and then they're for about 4 months. Then they come out of that and go into a farrowing crate, where they give birth and raise their piglets for 3 to 4 weeks. Then they go back into that crate. So basically, they go from one crate to another. And then they're basically burned out after 2.5 years, and then they cull them. The other one it's called a calf ranch, and those are usually male dairy calves, which have very little value. I've been on some of these in California, and they're huge. And each of those little calves is in a little, sometimes they're plastic, sometimes they're wood. But they don't have much, a male dairy calf doesn't make milk, don't have a lot of value, so we sort of warehouse them. But that's there's lots of different types of industrial or factory farms. Here's kind of a well-known slide. And this slide was put up this paper was put up by animal scientists who's saying how great all the improvements we've made in poultry. These are broilers, meat chickens. So it's kind of interesting, and I look at it as the opposite. So the first two, 57 and 78, those are chickens that were not selected for breast meat and fast growth. And that's the Ross 308. There's 3 or 4, they're called Cornish cross hybrids, that are the major commercial chicken breeds now. And they get slaughtered typically about day 43. But if you keep that Ross 48 alive, you can see what happens to it. They actually can't survive that long. You can imagine you couldn't support your body weight. They grow so fast that if they were a human being, they're equivalent to a human being weighing 600 pounds at 2 months of age. They selected for growth and fast growth and muscle mass. You can see how the breast muscles just go crazy. Here's another example of a Holstein is basically a normal cow body attached to giant udders. You can see how thin it is too, because all the cow's energy goes into making milk. And that's that model, one grossly exaggerated body system. So genetic selection is a driver or a form of poor welfare. So as I mentioned before, in factory farming in general, and factory farming research, one goal is a production efficiency. When you have production efficiency, a lot of bad things happen as consequences, what I'll call bite back or blowback. There's 2 types of those. Some are high priority. That means it costs the industry a lot of money. So if you have animals crowded, like in that top, crowded together, and bird flu gets in there, that's not normal, and then bird flu goes in and kills everything. In the other case, like with laying hens or crowded in little cages, almost all those laying hens will have salmonella. That's just a consequence, a blowback or a bite back system. So they care about things that cause people, industry, big ag and research works on things that cost industry money. So animal disease is a big deal. Zoonoses, which are diseases transmitted from animal to people, those are a big deal because they cost them money. Meat gets contaminated. There's some big outbreaks going on now. You have to recall millions of pounds of meat, or you pay huge fees or from legal lawsuits you pay people who got sick. And the third is antibiotic resistance. That's partly because FDA and consumer pressure, they're decreasing the allowable, or they're minimizing the use of antibiotics. That's a big research area, is finding alternatives to antibiotics. Things they don't care about from a research side and from a industry side is animal welfare, because it doesn't cost them money. The economic externalities, because we're paying for it, they're not paying for it. So, and the family farm extinction. And actually, also what's gone extinct are farm veterinarians, the part of the rural demise. Does anybody know what those purple things are? Yeah, it's hog manure and urine. So the buildings dump into those. They're pink because there's a bacteria, sulfur-producing bacteria that lives off the manure. And when they had the recent hurricane, on the right, the upper one is before the hurricane, after the hurricane, so all that manure got dumped into, these are close to the coast, dumped in the river and then goes on the ocean. So that's an example of bite back. But it's not a big priority because we're paying for that, not the industry. This is a feedlot. These are all over. Yeah, where I live in Nebraska, they're all over the state, actually. Anywhere from, I've been on one in Texas with more than 100,000 animals. In Nebraska, they're usually about 50,000. But you can see they're crowded together. This is the most unnatural habitat, a natural feed you can have for a cow. They live in these pens for, it depends how big they are when they come in, let's say 6 to 9 months. That little mound there, they pick a tract, whatever, and make a mound. That's a manure mound, so they can get out of the wet manure, they can go in the dry manure. So I did a lot of my research on feedlot animals because that's what we have in Nebraska. Now here's a friend of mine runs an organic farm. He's got about 800 or 900 cows. And this is what Bernie Rowland would call telos. You familiar with the concept of telos? That means let an animal be an animal. A cow in a feedlot cannot act like a cow. This is how a cow should be. A cow is designed to graze. So that's the normal system. And telos means letting an animal behave socially, nutritionally, in all ways, the way a cow should, and a factory farm is really the opposite of that. Okay, this is what I did for a big chunk of my research career when I was with the USDA. In those feedlots, you get lots of salmonella and a bacteria called E. coli 0157. So how it works is it doesn't bother the cattle. In fact, they grow better with it. So they're colonized, and then the manure contaminates the meat at slaughter, hamburger, and then people eat the contaminated meat and they get sick. In fact, that picture on the right, which is red, that's a colon from a little kid who died of it, just filled with blood. So these costs in lawsuits, if a kid gets this, I've been a legal consultant on several of these cases. Settlements are usually at least $1 million, depending on how severe the illness is. So this is a high priority for two reasons. It causes human impact in lawsuits. It also caused millions and millions of pounds of recalls over the years. This is a new disease that showed up in about 1993. And that's why I got working on it in 1994, right after it became available. And I tried everything I could to try to eliminate this in feedlots, and nothing worked. And I realized I was trying to divide by zero. When I went back and looked, I'm sorry, if you look at this, if this was, you cannot control they're living in their own manure, you cannot control a gut pathogen, right? It's impossible. I tried forever, I finally realized it was stupid. I mean, I didn't pick the project I was assigned, but I spent like $13 million, about $1 million a year doing this. So it was total waste. It was total waste of money. Yeah, the purple represents bacteria, the bacteria, by the way. Okay, next slide. Here's the worst case of bite back ever, and it links. This is feeding dead cows to live cows. So the USDA did the initial research in the 1960s, and they showed if you feed Because what do you do with a dead cow? They call them 4Ds. Dead, diseased, dying, or disabled. They can't go in the food supply. What do we do with them? Let's feed them to live cows. So they render them, which means you boil them, and so basically you take the bones with a little bit of meat on it, and then you dry it and grind it up, and it's called animal flour or meat and bone meal. And then you feed that to cows, and actually it's got high protein, and dairy cows do well on it. They did small scale. Then UNL got funding from industry. The Feed and Protein Research Foundation, they give money to the University of Nebraska, and they scaled it up. And they showed that this works really well, but a phenomena, I won't explain it, bypass protein effect. That's how it works. And so there were lots of peer-reviewed scientific papers that this is great. Then this picture on the track on the left, that's a warehouse full of meat and bone meal. Imagine how many cows that is. And then in Europe, they don't have soybeans, so protein is expensive. And so they started feeding in the 1980s, based on the research done at UNL and other places, to dairy cows, and that led to mad cow disease. They killed millions of cows. We had a few cases here. It caused billions and billions of dollars worldwide. And then it's caused, if you eat, in some people, it's probably dose dependent, I'm not sure why. If you eat a hamburger that has this mad cow disease, it's called a prion, then people get a disease called new variant Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, and you die from that. But this had, if you think about it, I think it's just stupid research. If you just think about it, feeding a dead animal to a live animal, I mean, it's just abnormal. The cow had no choice in the matter. Okay, so summarizing in a factory farm, animals are machines. There was a famous book called Animals Are Machines. If you've heard of it, you should read it. It's a very short book. That started the whole factory farm. She was a Rachel Carlson equivalent for factory farming back in the 60s. She was a Brit. And then production efficiency is inversely related to animal welfare. Higher the production efficiency, the lower the welfare. Okay, talk about MARC a little bit. It's in south central Nebraska, flyover or drive-through country, as they say. This is the research center. It used to be in World War II, they made munitions there, so it's got all these bunkers that they stored bombs and weapons in. So the question is, I think Chris alluded to this, what happens when what happens to the well-being of research livestock when there's basically no regulations, or the regulations are ignored, or when they exempt institutions from things like the AWA or animal welfare oversight, when the culture is insensitive to livestock well-being, and the research funding is non-competitive and perpetual, which is how it works in the USDA. It's not a grant, the money just comes every year. And when I went out to interview out there in late 80s, my ex-wife said, it's not the end of the earth, but you can see it from here. If you ever go out there, it's extremely desolate. I'm used to it now, but if you go out there, just drive through that part of the state. It's a very desolate looking place. So it's the world's largest animal research center. As I mentioned before, it's run cooperatively between University of Nebraska and USDA, although USDA has the veto power. Their mission is to solve priority problems for swine, sheep, red meat, swine, sheep, and cattle. Their objectives is, this is a quote, red meat production efficiency for consumers, producers, and animal agribusiness. But they really focus on animal agribusiness, I think. They say their conception to consumption, everything from animals to breeding livestock to, they actually have food testing of meat, things like that. So it's that whole range. If you're an animal scientist, it's like the Mayo Clinic or the Harvard for a law school. It's where you want to go. They have a $20 million federal budget and $5 million more from selling livestock, 36,000 animals. If you add that up over the 50 years there, that's about 2 million livestock years. It'd be like, you heard of a company, a plumber, we have 420 years of experience. It's for all the employees. So if you add up the numbers, it's a lot of animal years at that place. And 35,000 acres is about 2.5 times the size of Manhattan Island in New York, just to give you an idea. It's big. So here's a kind of map of the center. Those little circles are irrigation because there's underground water. Actually, it's fossil water. It's from 10,000 years ago. It's being mined. It's kind of triangular. Let's see. So there's a campus in the middle, which is where the USDA scientists are, the administration. And then in the field, outside of that, the UNL employees are the ones who take care of the animals, cowboys, cowgirls, shepherds, things like that. if you notice upper right there, there's a town called Harvard. It's a tiny little town, maybe 200 people, but there's a railroad that went through there, put it in the late 1800s, and the guy had a relative who went to Harvard, so he named the town Harvard. So you can go to Harvard in Nebraska, too. Okay. This breaks down the animals, number of animals. You can see that up to 36,000, mostly in the springtime, because those will always be sold when they get bigger. Let's see. So they mentioned about 100 USDA employees and about 100 UNL employees who work in the field. And there's also a small veterinary center there for training veterinarians and training veterinary students. I worked there for a few years, 7 or 8 years as well. Their primary focus, though, is genetics, making new breeds by mixing different breeds together and make new ones. That was why the center was founded. And there's a case system there. There's sacred cows, their priority, and higher than anything else. And then you have pigs, and then below that are sheep, and the nickname for sheep it's up there. So sheep and swine are treated poorly because they don't have status. Okay. That's a duplicate slide, I'm sorry. So, okay, now we'll put this in context of the Animal Welfare Act and IACUC. So I hope you can explain this slide. So the red means it was an ignored law or policy, and the check mark means it was mandated by law or was USDA policy. So universities are exempt from, they're required to follow AWA and IACUC, animal livestock universities. The USDA is not required. But they instituted a policy for IACUC in 2002 throughout USDA, but it was ignored. They didn't implement it, even though the internal policy said do it. So what else have we got on here? Oh, but what they did, so the animals are owned, until a few years ago, were owned by UNL, University of Nebraska, so they should have been subject to IACUC and Animal Welfare Act, but University of Nebraska, I think, illegally exempted those animals from IACUC and Animal Welfare Act. If this sort of makes sense. I know it's kind of confusing.
Can you maybe quickly explain what an IACUC is?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry, I used an acronym. So basically, animal welfare is basically, I'll call it external, what's the word? Oversight. Inspectors from USDA can come in and they can, whenever they want to, unannounced, and they can check and see if there's violations of the Animal Welfare Act. IACUC is an internal honor system. It's basically put together a protocol, a research protocol involving animals, and there's a committee, has to have a veterinarian on it, scientist, an outside member, at least 3 members. And they look at it and they evaluate in terms of, can you lower the number of animals? Are you controlling pain? What bad outcomes will happen? And they should have the power, if something goes bad, they can cancel it or make you modify it. So but it's an honor system. There's nobody checking up on it formally. So it's an internal system versus an external one. AWA is more external. Actually, IACUC is part of Animal Welfare Act, the revised one, I think, in 1985. Is that good enough, Chris? You want to expand on that? Okay. So we have 2 million animal years not subject to IACUC or Animal Welfare Act is bottom line. Sorry, it's a busy slide. Now, these are different examples of projects done at MARC. So one, they had something called the twinning project. Cows normally have a single offspring. They said, well, they're big animals. If we get 2 animals or 3 animals per cow, we increase the production efficiency. So for 30 years, they selected for twinning. And technically, it was a success. Normally, a cow has 1% have twins, and they got it up to 50% having twins. So technically, it worked. It took 30 years on $100 million. But the deal is you're fighting nature. There's a reason cows, over millions of years, they're designed to have 1 animal. And because you're making them have twins, they would have dystocia, the body parts get stuck, and the calves die because they can't get out. They had mastitis problems, inflammation of the udders. The most valuable offspring of any livestock is a female, and the females, if they're twin with a male, they're hermaphrodites. The male hormones from the male fetus masculinize the female fetus. Anyway, in 2008, it was abandoned after 30 years. There's no market for it. In fact, producers, if they get a cow that have twins, they get rid of it. They don't want it. They don't want those genetics in the herd. So this is just, I'm going to call it, it was stupid science. but they're in the name of production efficiency. But they had all the money for 30 years. It wasn't competitive, so they could I'll say it was playing around. It was a ridiculous experiment with animal welfare implications. Here's another one. Nebraska, MARC worked on this. Other places did it well. But there's a gene in cattle called myostatin. Statin means to slow down. And the gene it was a natural mutation they found. And what it does is, so myostatin stops the growth of muscle. When that gene is mutated, the muscles, there's no break. So the cattle just keeps growing more and more and more muscle. So you've got more commodity, right? You've got more meat. So again, remember the idea is having more. So and of course you can imagine, with all that muscle mass, they overheat. They can't give birth. There's just, if it's a female, they have poor fertility, poor calf viability. So after, I don't remember how long. It was this lasted probably for 8 years. I don't know the amount of money, but many millions of dollars. And they abandoned it. Again, there's no market for it. If that makes sense. It was predictable it wouldn't work. Now here's one that I have a lot of slides on this, which is probably the most well-known part of the New York Times piece. They designed a project called Easy Care Sheep. The sheep industry is going extinct. 55 million sheep after World War II, and they're down to maybe 3 or 4 million now. So it's just on a death spiral, a death curve. So the purpose of this is they work closely with the industry. How do we save the sheep industry? Well, let's cut back the inputs. Let's not have labor. Let's not minimize the feed, do all those kind of things. So they've created a new breed, which has a hair breed. The wool quality in the US is terrible. You have to pay to shear them, and there's no market for it. So they made a hair sheep, which sheds its hair. You don't have to have a person come and shear them. So they had about 1,500 ewes, which made 3,000 to 4,000 lambs per year. They put them on pastures in the middle of nowhere in the center. No protection from weather or rain or predators. And by protocol, the shepherds were not allowed to intervene with an animal in distress. So if it's sick, you couldn't treat it. So the idea was, let's just see who can survive the system, and those are easy care sheep. And so it was a brutal genetic selection process by being a hands-off system. So the surviving ewes and lambs from the system were genetically selected. They were successfully selected. So basically what they're trying to do is, sheep were domesticated about 10,000 years ago. You're taking a domestic sheep and trying to reconvert it into a wild sheep that can live on its own. But they've been designed over centuries of 10,000 years of domestication to have this symbiotic relation with people where they need us and we need them. And they're violating that social contract with this project. So here's an example. Typically in the Midwest, in the wintertime, they lamb in a shed, protected from the weather. They're outside all year. They get rained on, snowed on, hailed on. Normally in every other sheep producer, they're going to be in a barn with a heat lamp. They're put in a little place where the mother and the lambs can bond together for 24 to 48 hours. Out on that pasture, maybe the first lamb will bond with the mother, but then it wanders off and doesn't bond because they're designed to have to be in that pen to bond. So a lot of the lambs wander off and then they die of starvation or a coyote eats them. And normally sheep are on summer pasture only. Here they're on pasture the year round. So what happens when you do that? First of all, you get to stoach. They won't intervene if the animal's having difficulty birth so that you can die or the lamb can die. You get the weak ewe-lamb bond. So that means the lambs could be abandoned. If they're abandoned, they could die later. Coyote can kill them. They can die from exposure, or they can die from starvation. Lots of things like that. All of them are not good. So they would have typically anywhere, depending on the year, anywhere from 10% to 50% of the lambs would die. Had to do with weather mostly. So here, actually, Michael Moss, the New York Times reporter, he came out to MARC, wanted to see this project. There were about 30 lambs that had died the day before. And the day we were there was a hailstorm, and it killed about 120 lambs. Because the hail, sometimes I never believed that you actually do get baseball-sized hail there. This was in May. That's hail time. So just to give a few of these pictures of these were animals that I had necropsied. Seed. It's easy to tell what they died of. You can see the blood. I'm sorry. It's a coyote. a stillbirth, a dystocia, they're stained with meconium, it didn't get out alive, hypothermia, starvation. I'll just show some quick, I know these are kind of, I don't want to disturb you. This one was upper right, killed by coyote, they grabbed by the head, the brains are coming out. But this lamb also, you can look in the stomach, it's full of milk. So it ate, but it nursed, but a coyote got it. So here's one that actually starved to death. That's the stomach and it's empty. So you can easily figure out what they died of. It's not hard to do. I could train interview in 5 minutes probably. So what are the problems with this? Lots of animal well-being issues that I mentioned. No human intervention permitted. Violation of the human-animal, domestic animal-human contract was a big deal. And this wasn't intensive management, it was no management. It's a little bit different. Not even over 17 years and probably at least $17 to $20 million didn't get even a single peer-reviewed paper, which is the metric of science, is peer-reviewed papers. No IACUC, no market for this. Same old story, right? No market, nobody wants a bunch of sheep, they're gonna die. And it was stupid science. I should tell you this, I would not have, if 10 years ago, I would have said that was fine. I was a believer in production medicine. I had a conversion process. So there's scientific malpractice, but there's also mismanagement. People take care of the animals. This particular ewe happened to find on the center, and it had a tooth abscess, so it couldn't eat. It just ignored. It couldn't eat, so it was starving. They call them sausages, I'm sorry for the term. They have rectal prolapses. That's epidemic. It might be genetic. I'm not sure what causes that. And a lot of those they just don't treat. A few years ago, they had this cowgirl managed this herd of about 500. You see some bulls, they were starving. She asked for more feed. The cattle manager said no. 8 of the bulls starved to death. And this other one's more of is a disease. Cows don't have very good sensory perception. They can eat nails, and if they eat nails, it can go through, penetrate the stomach, go into the heart. But if you use a magnet, give them a magnet, you can prevent, it's easy to prevent for a 50-cent magnet. They don't want to do that. Okay, I'm sorry, this is a super busy slide. Kind of a summary. You got scientific malpractice or administrative malpractice. You've got livestock malmanagement or mismanagement. And then the other thing is important here, marginalized vets. So to treat an animal there, a vet had to ask the scientist, even if it was an emergency, if you could treat it. And they could say no, then it would just die. I'll just cover some of these. And a lot of animal scientists and technicians did surgeries by the thousands, and they weren't trained in doing it. I'll show one example of that. That's a dehorning. You just take a big thing and chop it off. But it's very simple. In 5 minutes, you can inject a little lidocaine like your dentist does, and they don't feel it. But they don't do that. There's very little pain management.
Can I point out one thing on here that was really important from your other talk? So the no oversight. So there's no oversight on approving whether these experiments should happen, no IACUC, but no peer-reviewed publication is ever going to publish anything about an experiment that didn't have an IACUC, so they're actually lying and claiming when they're submitting these articles for publication that there was an IACUC oversight, but it actually wasn't.
Yeah, actually that's what happened is the main journal they submit to is the Journal of Animal Science, and they always said we did IACUC, and there were probably hundreds of papers submitted, and how do you retract 100 papers or whatever it was? So the journal decided not to retract them. But they lied basically that they had it. Because if you don't have that in there, the paper won't be accepted. But some of these have improved, actually, post-whistleblowing. So it's not quite as bad as it was. Here's an example of a surgery. I'm sorry, it's hard to tell, but animal scientist didn't know what he was doing. He took an ovary out, didn't tie up the ovarian artery. The cow died, had like a gigantic blood clot in the stomach. That little blue thing was the clamp. He didn't clamp it. Probably should have sutured it. But animal scientists, they can do whatever they want. Surgery-wise, they can do whatever they want. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but there is this symbiosis between Big Ag and MARC. How it works is you can't directly lobby Congress. Executive branch can't. It's called the Hatch Act. So what they do is USDA MARC would tell the National Cattlemen, for example, we want to do this. Then they would lobby their congressmen, and they would get earmarks or increases in budgets to do what they want. In return, then when the industry wants research done quickly, MARC would do that research for them. The bite back kind of stuff. I'll skip the slide, but that's just an example. So industry invested 5.2, and they got $21 million worth of subsidized research by MARC. I'll be happy to leave this here, this PowerPoint. I saw somebody taking notes, so if you don't want to take notes, you don't have to. So I think this is the end slide in this section. Politics and laws matter. I think that's the bottom line. AWA and ICUC are imperfect, as Chris said, but they're still important. And this, not all of it, but most of the things, there were hundreds, well, I mean, there were dozens of examples. I just gave you 3 here. But a lot of this, the bad welfare and other bad outcomes would have been prevented if they would have implemented the AWA and ICUC, which they should have done, but they ignored it or were exempt from it. What are we doing on time, Chris? We're running out.
We've got the room for 1:15, so maybe, yeah, if you want to go to about 1, and then we can open up questions.
It's about 1, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, I did some whistleblowing on this. I used to be a big ag supporter, then I changed my mind. Atheist, agnostic, whistleblower, activist. That's my process. Sorry to go through this so fast, but we'll just try to get through this. One thing, a big influence on me is my daughter started a CSA, organic CSA, and she raised acre of flowers to feed the bees. Her honey was called Not Tonight Honey. That's her garden there. She raised swine, she raised chickens, lots of all open source. And that, my lesson was there's an alternative way to do things, and also the quality is much higher. It was small scale, but we used to argue. I would say, meat is feeding the world, my job is made on raising meat. And she would say otherwise, and she convinced me, not the other way. I don't know, this is my whistleblowing story, it's long. I'll skip that, but basically it was a long process.
You just got to talk a little bit about it, I think.
Okay, so it happened about 2007-14, I documented abuse that I saw, told my boss every year, nothing happened. Then, I documented, reported it. Then after 6 or 7 years, I called Michael Moss. He was a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter who had worked on E. coli. I just Googled and he popped up. And then I contacted him and we went back and forth. Then I leaked, since I knew that place really well, I'd been there for 20-something years, I knew where the dead bodies were buried, so to speak. I said, FOIA this and FOIA this. He ended up getting 10,000 pages of documents. And New York Times spent, I don't know, $150,000 on this. They had Michael Moss and 2 other people working on this, maybe more than that, full time. I also reported to our institutional vet. He told me, if I do anything, I can get fired. I'm staff with 30-day notice. So he didn't do anything either because his job was at risk. He wasn't faculty, he was staff. Then I got caught when I brought Michael Moss on the center. They found me there. Then I was banished forever from MARC. I tried to get whistleblower protection, but it was denied. I think for political reasons. I qualified, but they didn't want to piss off the university. The end there was, I was an admin leave, a sick leave, and then the flame there, they tried to fire me for 1.5 years. My tenure protected me somewhat, but also I didn't violate any UNL. I violated USDA policy, but not UNL policy, and I worked for UNL, so they actually couldn't fire me, but I paid a lot to a lawyer. So then, okay, the little chicken up there, that's a chicken, S-H-I-T. That's how I felt. So I had, after I got outed, DHS, state police, had calls and things like that. And then a little later, when Michael Moss came out a few months later, same thing again. I got, same thing, interviewed by the FBI. They said I was a suspect eco-terrorist. Then I was forced out, transferred to Lincoln, and I'm in the process of being fired a second time. So, which is okay, because I don't want to be there, but I'll be forced out probably for a couple of years. But then I got involved on the activist side, which was good for me. That's sort of a whistleblowing story. When the police were looking for me, my friend owns a 10,000-acre farm. I would hide out in this old farmhouse. Because my lawyer said, you don't have to tell the police where you are. You know, they would be calling me, and they would say, where are you? And I wouldn't tell them. So I was hiding out here twice. Here's an article from the Times from January 2015. This is a summary of the whistleblowing. I realize the same story every time. I had USDA and UNL, they're huge resources, the police. legal system, lots of money, and my resources. This is what whistleblowers lose. 80% of the time you lose. That's in that book. I wish I read the Whistleblower's Handbook. If you're going to whistleblow, read that book before you do it. It's a very preventive medicine. I had a group called GAP, which is a whistleblower organization in DC, and they represent, like Eric Snowden, and they represent me pro bono for some things, which is great. That's the Food Integrity Campaign, which is the food-related whistleblower organization. Tell me when to stop, Chris, because I will. Okay, I mentioned I don't regret whistleblowing, but I would do it different. I would have read that book first. But I thought I could remain secret, that I wouldn't get caught. I'm sure they suspected me, but they couldn't prove it. I'm sorry, I'm burning through these. But there were some good things happen. Chris mentioned this. There was a change in policy. Now all the USDA, they didn't change the law, but USDA, they're subjected to IACUC and AWA rules, even though Congress imposed that without changing the law. They got 2 new DVMs. One is master's students, and they're empowered, unlike before. They actually they have power. They can do things. There was an Office of Inspector General did a report, but I would say it was milquetoast. They didn't really say, they didn't say MARC was too bad. Congress withheld about $60 million for a couple of years. That hurt. That's some penalty. But the bottom line is really important. MARC just says that they're innocent. They think they did nothing wrong. That's partly a cultural thing, which is one reason why they resisted. I'm probably getting pretty close to being done here. Here's the act. They tried to change the law. It didn't pass. Oh, they're still doing inspections now. Now that the AWA is doing inspections, this just happened in 2017. MARC still has violations. So and as well as other ARS institutions. So it's better than it was, but it's still going on. Okay, I can call this my last slide, summary slide. So I would say law, politics, regulations, they're necessary, but probably not sufficient. But as Chris said, what we have, I'm glad that we have it, because it can help a lot. It'd be great if they could revise those or enforce them better. Big Ag has a huge influence. It's basically survives, the factory farm survived because of subsidies and economic externalities. If we could decrease those, you decrease factory farming. And I think I'll just stop there. That's okay. I'm sorry I rushed it at the end.
We've got about 10 minutes for some questions, so please raise your hand and I'll come to you, and please wait for the mic because we're recording.
Just really quickly, what were the police called on you for? Was it just bullshit, like criminal trespassing charges? Was it coordination with the FBI on eco-terrorism charges, or what?
Yeah, let me see. The FBI agent just showed up unannounced with the chief of police of UNL and said he wanted to interview me. I tried to call my lawyer. I couldn't get hold of him. So stupidly, I talked to him for 3 hours. He didn't call me an eco-terrorist, but that was his specialty. So he didn't say, you're an eco-terrorist, but he's questioning me, are you working with Antelope Liberation Front? Are you, all those types of questions? And what was the second question?
The police, local police.
Oh, sometimes they would follow me. Like I leave the driveway, the state police would just follow me where I'm going. They asked me to come in when I'm at my hideout. They would ask me to come in, and I said, no, I'm not going to. They wouldn't say why. They said, just come in, we want to question you. I wasn't going to do it. On my lawyer's advice, he said, don't go in. So, and then eventually it settled down, and yeah. I was never arrested.
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm actually from Nebraska, so I appreciate it. Not very many Midwesterners around here. Do you know Common Good Farm by any chance?
Well, what city is it in, or what is it near?
It's, so my aunt, Ruth Chantry, has a small CSA.
I've been there. I've been on that place, south of Lincoln.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been there, yeah.
So,
They raise mostly dairy goats.
It's
and
actually,
organic farm.
Yeah, it's organic and biodynamic. But anyway, thanks for coming. I was wondering, since I'm from Nebraska, if you've seen any or been able to implement any cultural shift at UNL in terms of like encouraging students to get interested in this, or doing research or teaching around it.
Absolutely not. I tried to put together an animal welfare course, and they said no. There's no animal welfare course on campus, so there was an open niche, and they said, can't do it. No, it's extremely pro. Well, they get their money from ag. I don't blame them, actually. They get all the money from feed companies, contract research, USDA, so they don't want to bite the hand that feeds them. So yeah, the culture is extremely pro-industrial ag.
And I forgot to mention, Jim got both his DVM and his PhD from the University of Illinois, which is my alma mater, and they have a couple people in their animal science department that are pretty progressive, Amy and Fisher, and they've got a welfare class, and they actually showed earthlings in an animal science course at University of Illinois, which is pretty astounding.
Yeah, the Illinois is way ahead of Nebraska, Chris.
Hi, thank you for coming. For those of us in here who are future lawyers, where do you see our role in this, and where's the highest valued use for whatever skills and talents we may be able to bring to this fight?
I think Chris might be a better person to answer that question than, where's Chris, than I. No? Yeah,
I think some of what you have on.
Did you want to answer that?
I think some of what you have on that screen is good, just about how the Western.
You know, one thing about the policy, which there's a woman named Suzanne McMillan who's the farm animal policy person for ASPCA, lives in Colorado, and she works, anyway, she said the problem with policy is, she calls it fickle. Policy is fickle. So the new administration, policy can change. So she actually believes, that's her job, but she believes you get more impact working with corporate people. You know, like you say, I didn't show the slide, but Carl Icahn forced McDonald's to, he said, if you don't go to cage-free over time, I'm going to ruin your stock value. So they did. That's a different model, right? You can have an economic model, you can have a policy model, you'd have, you know, law, legal model. So I think it's a multi-pronged approach, and policy is one of the ways. Policy matters. Even the Animal Welfare Act, as Chris said, it's weak in a lot of ways, but I'm glad it's there. It's something.
So I hope I can squeeze in 2 questions here. You mentioned at the outset of your talk that the overriding goal was efficiency, like more, bigger, for cheaper. And I'm just wondering if you have any sense, you know, at the institution you're at, or just larger in the larger culture, how the clean meat research is seen. Is it seen with promise, or is it seen as
Okay, I'm going to violate my rule.
enemy?
I'm going to go to one of the slides that I cut out. So here's the clean meat slide. You can also change by technology disruption. So when clean meat came out, it was $1.1 million per pound in 2013 when it was invented by a Dutch scientist. In 2018, it's $37 a pound. But if you take meat, it's meat hamburger rather, $3.86. If you add the extra economic externalities, it's actually about $40 per pound. So they're actually about the same price right now. And it's projected, this you don't know for true, they're trying to do, a lot of companies doing scale up. In 2 or 3 years, it's expected to be about the same price. But there's still technical problems, you know, it's not a guarantee it's going to work. But it's an example of the whole system. If that system works, you could just, the livestock industry, most of it would go away. Yes?
My second question is about
I'm sorry, then.
No,
I'm sorry, Linda.
You mentioned that you had applied for protection and that you were denied, and I was just curious about that.
Yeah, well, there's actually, it's something called the, it's not called the Whistleblower Act, but they have a protection for state employees. You know, if you're a state employee, which I am, protection from retaliation. So you apply in writing, and then you have an interview. And the guy said, I think you qualify, but then he never responded. He never responded at all. So I never had any protection. It's state level. My lawyer says he didn't want to piss off the university. I'm a pawn. Why would he want to piss off the most powerful institution in the state? That's conjecture from my lawyer. But maybe mad he didn't even respond, you know. And also, even with the university, their policy is you can report animal abuse without retaliation. They ignored that too.
Okay, great. Well, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. So please
Okay.
join me again in thanking Jim King.